when you think about something like the All In podcast, I don't think any of you would position yourself as a journalist, but obviously there's a lot of people who consume that content because they want to learn, they want to actually get information as to what's happening in current events. How different is that actually than some of these media companies where people are, hiding behind or kind of positioning themselves as journalists? Like, is it now everyone on the internet's a content creator, or is there still a big difference in your opinion?
Well, I think we have this epidemic of fake experts, people who claim some sort of expert status, but really as a way to shut down the debate. Like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm an expert, so just listen to me. I think if you're an entrepreneurial type of person, that sort of appeal to authority has never worked. Founders always start from having an idea that's either contrarian or no one's really thought of before. And this idea that, oh, I need to listen to what somebody else says automatically without consulting, my own my own ideas, my own worldview, because there's some sort of expert. I think that's never been compelling to people in our world. But that's kind of what you get a lot of in the traditional media. Now, I don't purport to be an expert. I'm just a consumer of information. But what I try to do is go out and research the topics that we're going to talk about on the pod and formulate my own view and synthesize material from people who I find compelling or convincing. And then I repackage it in my own way and then talk about that. So, and then people either like it or they don't. But yeah, that's what I try to do.
And how important is it that you actually have skin in the game? I think another piece of this is like, a journalist or a blogger or whoever on the internet opinion, whether it's right or wrong, kind of there's no feedback loop, there's no accountability, just move on to the next, hot take or prediction versus the market participant, whether it's an entrepreneur or an investor. If you're wrong and you put money behind it, you lose money, right? And then there is that kind of feedback loop. And so is that play an important role as well in terms of the way that you think about the content that you guys are producing? Yeah,
certainly when it comes to all the business topics, we do actually have skin in the game. We're participants in the ecosystem. We're discussing business strategies that we ourselves are implementing. And so there is, market feedback on that. And if we're wrong, then we will pay a penalty. You just don't see that, in general in the news media. And there seems to be no penalty for being wrong. It just seems like we just move on to the next topic, and there's never a comeuppance for the people who are so tragically wrong about what the last issue was. Where was the comeuppance, for example, for the foreign policy establishment that got us into the Iraq War and got us into a losing effort in Afghanistan for 20 years? I mean, these people are still in the government. There's just no heads have rolled. Even the Bosch withdrawal from Afghanistan, no heads rolled for that. There's no accountability. So there's so many issues like that. The lockdowns that we pursued during COVID, now everybody, I think, has sort of admitted that they're wrong. There was a video going around of Bill Gates basically saying they didn't work. So even the people who were advocating for them at the time now admit they were just tragically wrong, basically cratered our economy, didn't stop the virus. Where's the comeuppance for the people who promoted those policies? I think there will eventually be, hopefully, at the ballot box, but certainly in the media, they're not holding anybody accountable.
Yeah. Well, and I would even argue that many of the people in the media don't believe that they didn't work, right? They still would advocate that they were important and in some ways that we should still have some form of these things. When you talk about this like fake expertise or this appeal to expertise, it just makes me think of the time when Fauci was doing an interview and he basically said like, I represent science. Right. And that's one example of many, I think, in society. But like, it is important, I think, to have people who are not market participants commentating, et cetera, but it does feel like podcasts, Twitter, and many of these other forums have let the market participants now have a voice. And in some cases, if you look at Elon and some of these folks who have tens of millions of followers on these platforms, they have a bigger voice than even some of the media companies. Like I think I saw when Elon went to go buy Twitter, I went and I looked, and Elon has double the number of followers on Twitter that the New York Times has. And Twitter does, much more revenue than the New York Times does. And so like, in some way, do you get the New York Times is now a competitor with Twitter? And if Elon owns Twitter, like, are you just a billionaire? Are you employing people at the New York Times as a billionaire to attack other billionaires? And like vice versa, like how do you think about that?
Well, I think that the traditional media has had a huge animus towards social networking for years because social networking has not only stolen all these page views and all this attention and engagement away from them and thereby, turn their analog dollars into digital pennies. Remember that old saying? So dramatically impacted their business model for the worse, but also has disintermediated them. I mean, the only time I ever go to the New York Times is if somebody who I like tweets something that's interesting that links to a New York Times article. So the power and influence of these publications has been dramatically reduced by social networking. And that's why you've seen basically this war on social networking. And the form it takes is basically these claims that, is primarily Facebook last year, it creates all these harms on society. And therefore we need to regulate and restrict and censor them. And, it's pretty striking that you see publications who are supposed to be champions of the First Amendment, because that's the principle on which their whole business is built, now advocating for censoring and restricting these platforms.
Yeah. Talk to me about the members of the All In podcast. Maybe the last thing we'll talk about. Do you and Jason like each other? Are you guys actually friends? All right.
Yes.
All right. I think a lot of people think you're friends, but then they listen to the podcast and like, man, they're always at each other's throat to some degree.
We also agree on a lot of issues. And, the way I kind of see it. So whenever there's an issue that Jason can see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears. So for example, San Francisco. We agree about like everything that's gone wrong in San Francisco. We probably vote the exact same way, in elections and so on. But when it comes to things that are far away, Jason relies, I think, to a great extent on the traditional news media for his views. And so on the pod, he's going to represent, like the Brian Stelter opinion or something. And so this is why we end up getting in disputes, is I'm like, dude, you're just repeating the same bullshit narrative that, we get in all these other places. I have to correct you on that. And then that starts a debate. So we do agree on a lot, but that's where things go off the rails.
Yeah. And obviously you're incredibly kind to him the entire time as well. When you think about so many of the people that you grew up in your career, right, as an entrepreneur and now as an investor, they've gone on to do amazing things. And some of them are still very publicly known and even participate in the podcast, all that. But many of them also just are busy building companies and people know about them, but they don't necessarily go in the media all the time. What's your relationship with them? I think a lot of people say like, hey, there's this group of folks from the PayPal Mafia that are all super, super successful. Like, do you guys have a secret chat where you're all constantly talking to each other? Is it just as normal friends as anybody else would have? Like, what does that relationship look like?
Well, there were pre-existing friendships before the PayPal Mafia that brought the team together. The one misconception about the PayPal Mafia is people think it was like some sort of very exclusive club. And the reality is we recruited our friends because nobody else would work at the company. This is go back to 1999. It was like much harder. And then 2000, after the dot-com crash, it was much harder to convince somebody to leave a safe, well-paying job at an investment bank or management consulting firm or a law firm to come work at a startup that was still seen as an incredibly risky thing to do. When I joined PayPal, everyone tried to talk me out of it, including from my parents on down. If I hadn't known Peter Thiel and been friends with him, I never would have taken that risk, and so on down the line. So Peter recruited the people he knew from Stanford. Max recruited the people he knew from U of I. So so there were a lot of pre-existing friendships, and then the experience of going through these PayPal wars together, I'd say generally develop those friendships even more. Now, it's not like we hang out with each other all the time, and it's not like one monolithic group, but we do tend to see each other from time to time in various contexts and catch up.
And why is it that you all were friends before? Like, is it just you happen to all end up at Stanford or U of I, or was there some common thread? Like, what brought you all together? Because I think a lot of people look around at their friend circle, let's say in college, and they're like, man, I don't think Elon Musk is hanging out here, right? I don't think whatever. Like, what brought you all together? What was like the selection mechanism that you kind of would attribute how you all ended up together?
Well, so Max recruited his engineering friends at U of I, so I think that was pretty straightforward. And then Peter recruited a number of the people he was friends with. And, Peter had founded the Stanford Review, which is sort of the conservative libertarian student newspaper on campus. And I had gone on to become an editor of that paper several years later. So that's how we met. So there was this libertarian strand to the founding team. And so we were all, and that was sort of like this contrarian, libertarians tend to be not just contrarian, but also sort of free market. And so there was a certain sense in which everybody was cut from this sort of entrepreneurial cloth. Now, it's not universally true. You know, like Reid Hoffman was not part of the Stanford Review. In fact, he was sort of on the other extreme. He was more liberal, and he still is to this day. But he and Peter used to have political debates or discussions in college, and then that's how Reid, you know, ended up being recruited by Peter. So it's not universally true, but there was something to that the founding team were, you know, like given the sort of the prevailing college. The prevailing culture on college campuses at that time, which was sort of this whole political correctness thing, we were rebels against that. And I think that rebel mentality translated well into becoming founders and entrepreneurs once we graduated.
Hey you, did you like this video? Great, we make 5 of them a day and post them here on this channel. Make sure you subscribe, like the video, and see you next time.